The recording device was still warm in my cardigan pocket when I stood up at the head of that table and set my late husband's business ledger down beside the champagne glasses. 41 faces turned toward me at once, mid-laugh, mid-toast, and I watched every drop of color leave my grandson's face as I pressed play. My son's hand froze halfway to his wine glass. My daughter-in-law's smile did not so much fall as shatter, and in the silence that followed, I heard, for the first time in 14 months, the sound of the truth finally being louder than the lies. Before I tell you how that night ended, I want to know something. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one. And if you believe that family is something you earn, not something you're simply handed at birth, do me a favor and hit like, subscribe, and stay until the end, because what these people did to me, and what I quietly did back, is not something you'll forget by morning. Now, to understand how we got here, we have to go back to a gray Tuesday afternoon 14 months earlier, to the exact moment my husband's heart simply stopped beating at his own workbench, sawdust still drifting down around his boots like it hadn't yet realized he was gone. My name is Harold James Whitfield. I am 71 years old, and for 33 years I worked as a certified fraud examiner and forensic accountant for a regional bank, tracing stolen money through shell companies, forged signatures, and falsified ledgers for a living before I retired at 68. I mention this now, at the very start, because it matters. Every skill I built across 3 decades of chasing other people's lies through paper trails and wire transfers would end up, in the end, aimed squarely at my own family. My husband, Walter Aldous Whitfield, built Whitfield Custom Woodworks from a rented garage in 1987 into a business that, by the year he died, was worth just over $14 million. He built oak dining tables and cherry cabinetry with his own 2 hands for the first 11 years before he ever hired a single employee, and by the time he collapsed at 76 years old, he had 47 people on payroll who called him, without a trace of irony, the old man with genuine affection. We had 2 sons. Bradley, our eldest, died 6 years earlier in a highway accident on a rain-slicked overpass, leaving behind a wife, Denise, and a young son named Preston. Our younger son, Marcus, became a corporate attorney, sharp-suited and soft-spoken, the kind of man who could make betrayal sound like prudence. When Walter died, his will named Preston, then 27 years old, as chief executive of the company, with the stated wish, written in his own looping handwriting, that the business stay in the Whitfield name, in Whitfield hands. I was left as majority trustee, holding 61% of the voting shares, with Marcus appointed as legal counsel to the family trust. It seemed, at the time, like a reasonable division of grief and duty. It was, I would later understand, the exact architecture of my own undoing. The wound came 11 days after Walter's funeral, on a rain-heavy Thursday in March, though I did not learn its true shape until much later. Marcus visited me at the house with a folder of what he called routine trustee paperwork, documents to formalize the transfer of certain accounts now that Walter was gone. I signed where he pointed, the way you do when your husband of 46 years has just been lowered into the ground, and every piece of paper afterward feels like one more small burial. What I did not know, what I would not discover for months, was that on that same Thursday, $206,844.19 was quietly wired out of Walter's supplemental retirement account, an account he had specifically earmarked for me in a handwritten note tucked inside his desk drawer, into a limited liability company called Bradmore Holdings. Bradmore Holdings had been incorporated 9 days earlier. Its registered agent was Marcus. I did not confront him about the money right away, because I did not yet know it existed. My first confrontation, 7 weeks later, was about something smaller and, I thought at the time, more innocent, a signature. I had been going through Walter's old files one evening in early May, the lamp throwing long shadows across his reading chair, which I still hadn't been able to move, when I found a copy of a document titled Trustee Acknowledgement and Voting Waiver, dated 73 days after the funeral, bearing my notarized signature. I had no memory of signing it, and reading it closely, in the careful and unhurried way 3 decades of examining fraudulent instruments had trained into my hands, I understood exactly what it did. It waived my 61% voting requirement for any single transaction under $5 million, handing Preston unilateral authority to sell company assets without so much as informing me first. I called Marcus the next morning and asked him, calmly, to explain the document. He came to the house that same afternoon, and I watched him settle into Walter's chair, with the easy confidence of a man who had already rehearsed his lie in the car on the drive over. He told me it was a standard estate simplification measure his firm used with every trust of this size, that I had signed it during the same batch of paperwork in March, that grief made people forget small administrative details all the time, and wasn't it easier, really, at my age, not to be burdened with every minor business decision? He said the words, "at your age," the way you'd offer someone a blanket, gently, as though he were protecting me rather than erasing me. I felt something cold and absolute settle into my chest as he spoke, the specific, quiet fury of watching someone lie to your face while pretending to comfort you. But I only nodded. I told him he was probably right, that my memory wasn't what it used to be, that I trusted him completely. I even patted his hand. Inside, some old, sharpened part of me, the part that had spent 33 years learning exactly what a lie sounds like when it's dressed up as kindness, was already taking notes. For the next several weeks, I became someone I was not. I let my hands tremble slightly when I poured tea. I asked Preston to repeat simple things twice, as though I were struggling to follow. I mentioned, twice, in front of Denise, that I sometimes couldn't remember what day it was. Meanwhile, quietly, methodically, mostly at night with the study door locked, I rebuilt my own investigation from the ground up. I called an old colleague from the bank, a forensic document examiner named Ruth Okafor, who confirmed within 4 days that the notary stamp on my signature belonged to a notary public who did not, according to state licensing records, exist. I opened a private account and began pulling public filings on Bradmore Holdings, tracing its formation date, its registered agent, its single deposit of $206,844.19. I hired a retired detective named Sam Kowalczyk, a friend of Walter's from the volunteer fire department, to quietly photograph who came and went from a rented storage unit Marcus had leased under the Bradmore name. Outwardly, I was a fragile widow, drifting a little further each week. Inwardly, I was building a case file thicker than anything I'd assembled in 33 years at the bank, and every single confused smile I gave my son across the dinner table cost me something I never let him see. The second discovery came 61 days into my investigation, on a humid evening in late June, and it was worse than anything I had prepared myself for. Sam's photographs from the storage unit showed Denise, my daughter-in-law, my son Bradley's widow, the woman I had held at his funeral 6 years earlier, arriving twice a week, always after dark, always leaving an hour and 40 minutes later. It took me another 11 days to understand what I was looking at. Marcus and Denise were not managing paperwork in that storage unit. They were having an affair that had apparently begun the previous winter, months before Walter even died. And buried inside an email thread Ruth helped me recover from a shared cloud drive tied to the trust account, I found the second half of it, a message from Marcus to Denise dated 3 weeks earlier, discussing a psychiatric evaluator named Dr. Holloway, a man Marcus had used before on other estate cases, someone who could be counted on to find diminished capacity in an elderly client regardless of what the actual examination showed. The evaluation was scheduled for the 9th of July. If it went the way Marcus intended, a court would appoint a conservator over my remaining 39% of shares and over my own home. The conservator, naturally, would be Marcus. My own son was not simply stealing from me. He was building the legal machinery to erase me entirely, and he was doing it in the arms of the woman who was supposed to be Bradley's widow, not his replacement. I will tell you honestly that reading those emails felt like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. But I did not fall into it. I sharpened instead. A cornered animal, I have since learned, does not panic. It goes very, very still, and it waits for the one moment its enemy makes a mistake. I decided to give them one. On the 2nd of July, 1 week before the scheduled competency evaluation, I staged a small collapse in the kitchen in front of Preston, letting my knees buckle just enough, my hand grasping the counter, my voice thin and frightened. He caught me, and to his credit, some genuinely alarmed part of him seemed to surface in that moment. A small, buried piece of him that still remembered I was his grandmother and not merely an obstacle. I let him see me recover slowly, and that evening, once he'd gone home, I left a folder on the kitchen table where I knew Denise would find it during her Wednesday visit to check on me. The folder was labeled, in my own careful handwriting, Revised Trust Draft, Complete Restructuring, Whitfield Woodworks Employee Ownership Transfer, and inside it sat a convincing but entirely fabricated draft transferring the entire company, all 39% of my remaining shares, and the house itself into an employee ownership trust for the 47 workers who had spent their careers under Walter's roof, cutting Preston, Marcus, and Denise out completely, with a sticky note. Reading only, meeting with new attorney, Thursday, 9 a.m. I had, 3 days earlier, asked Ruth to help me install 2 small recording devices, one behind a framed photograph of Walter in the front hallway, one inside a decorative clock in the kitchen, both angled toward the table where family conversations always seem to happen. They found the folder that same night. I know, because I was upstairs, lying very still in bed, listening to my own heartbeat and the low murmur of voices rising through the floorboards. Denise called Marcus within 9 minutes. He arrived at the house at 11:40 that night, and for the next 23 minutes, in my kitchen, beneath Walter's clock, the two of them said everything I needed them to say. Marcus called the competency evaluation insurance, in case the trust rewrite went through before he could stop it. Denise, her voice climbing toward panic, asked whether they should simply move the date of the evaluation up. Marcus told her not to worry, that the old woman doesn't know anything, she never has, and that within 2 weeks it wouldn't matter what I signed or didn't sign, because a judge would have already decided I couldn't be trusted to sign anything at all. I lay upstairs in the dark, and I did not cry. I felt, instead, something colder and far more useful settle over me, the specific, surgical calm of a woman who finally had every piece of the board in front of her, and knew, at last, exactly how the game would end. 2 days after the funeral folder trap, on a Saturday morning I will never forget, I learned the 6th-day sale had already happened, quietly, almost invisibly, while I'd been laying my trap. Preston, using the authority granted by the forged voting waiver, had listed Whitfield Custom Woodworks with a buyer named Victor Kessler on a Monday and closed the sale the following Saturday, 6 days later, for $2,350,000, roughly 1/6 of what an independent appraisal, which I quietly commissioned that same week, valued the company at closing to $14,600,000. It made no sense as a business decision. It made perfect sense as a crime. Kessler Industrial Group, according to state filings Ruth pulled within a single afternoon, was itself substantially financed through Bradmore Holdings, through Marcus. The plan, as best I could reconstruct it, was elegant in its ugliness. Sell fast, sell cheap, strip the factory's real estate and equipment for resale within the year, split the profit quietly between Marcus and Preston, and have me declared incompetent before I could ever object loudly enough for anyone to listen. Preston had told himself, I imagine, that he was simply moving fast in a difficult market. He did not yet understand that he had been a pawn positioned by two people far more practiced at this particular game than he was. They scheduled a closing celebration for the following Friday, a private dinner at the restaurant Walter used to take me to for our anniversary, of all places, with 41 guests, extended family, a handful of Kessler's people, even a few of Walter's old employees invited out of some grotesque sense of ceremony. I made sure Ruth was there, seated quietly near the back. I made sure Diane Okafor, no relation to Ruth, a sharp young trust attorney I had quietly retained 6 weeks earlier, was seated 2 tables from the head. I made sure Sam Kowalczyk, still carrying his old detective's instincts even in retirement, stood near the door. And I made sure a young investigative reporter named Aaron Choi, whom I'd spoken with twice under strict confidence, had a seat at the far end of the room with a notebook he pretended was for taking down toast quotes. I stood up during dessert. I remember the specific weight of the small recorder in my cardigan pocket, and the way the room's laughter died in pieces, table by table, as I began to speak. I did not raise my voice. I have never needed to raise my voice to be heard when I am telling the absolute truth. I laid Walter's old business ledger on the table, open to the page where I had annotated, in red ink, every fraudulent transfer, every forged date, every dollar that didn't belong where it had been sent. Then I played the recording from my kitchen, Marcus's voice, unmistakable, calling me the old woman who doesn't know anything, discussing the rigged competency evaluation as though it were a minor scheduling matter. I watched my son's face go the color of old paper. I watched Denise's hand, still holding her wine glass, begin to shake so badly the wine nearly spilled over the rim. I watched Preston, my grandson, 27 years old and only now beginning to understand the size of the trap he'd been used inside of, look back and forth between his mother and his uncle like a man watching the floor open beneath two people he'd trusted more than himself. Diane stood next and, in the flat, procedural voice of someone who has done this before, announced that an emergency injunction had already been filed that morning to void the sale on grounds of forged instruments and fraud against a minority trustee, and that copies of the recording, the forensic document analysis, and the Bradmore Holdings filings had already been delivered to the district attorney's office and to Kessler's own board of directors, who, she noted, almost gently, had not been told the full truth about their seller's finances either. Sam stepped toward the door, not dramatically, just present, The way a man stands when he wants everyone in a room to understand that leaving quickly would be unwise. 2 officers, whom Diane had arranged to wait outside rather than inside, out of some final mercy I still don't fully understand in myself, came in 11 minutes later and arrested Marcus on the spot, on charges of forgery and wire fraud, while Aaron Choi's pen never once stopped moving. What happened next happened fast, the way a house of cards doesn't fall so much as detonate. Marcus turned on Preston first, snarling across the table that none of this would have happened if Preston hadn't been so desperate to prove himself, so eager to sell fast and sell cheap the moment someone flattered him with a number. Preston turned on Denise, his own mother, demanding to know how long she'd been sleeping with his uncle, how long they'd been planning to have his own grandmother locked away as unfit. Denise, weeping now, turned back on Marcus, insisting it was his idea, all of it, from the very first Thursday afternoon 11 days after the funeral. Nobody defended anybody. Vultures, I have found, only ever circle the same carcass together for as long as there's meat left on it. 6 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Diane called to tell me the Kessler sale had been formally unwound by the court, the factory and its equipment restored to the trust, and the $206,844.19 traced back through Bradmore Holdings and returned, with interest, to the account Walter had specifically set aside for me. Marcus was disbarred within the year and pleaded guilty to reduce a sentence that still carries actual prison time. I did not attend the sentencing. I did not need to watch that particular ending in person to know it was real. I used part of the recovered money, along with a portion of my own savings, to establish the Walter Aldous Whitfield Apprenticeship Fund, which now trains 12 young woodworkers a year at the reopened shop, under the same brass bell Walter used to ring every morning at 7 to call the crew in from the parking lot. I rehired 39 of the original 47 employees within the first 2 months. I restructured my remaining ownership, with Diane's careful guidance, into a genuine employee trust, not as a decoy this time, but as the actual, permanent shape of the company going forward, exactly the kind of legacy Walter would have recognized as his own. I still go in most Tuesday mornings, and I still hear that bell, and for the first time in 14 months, hearing it doesn't hurt. Preston came to my door 8 months after that dinner, thinner than I remembered, his voice small in a way it had never been as a boy. He said he was sorry, that he'd been used, that he wanted to come home. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at a face that still, somewhere underneath everything, resembled his father's. Then I told him, quietly and without a trace of anger left in me, that I believed he was sorry, and that it changed nothing at all. I closed the door. I did not open it again when he knocked a second time, or a third. Some doors, once you understand what walked through them the first time, are simply not meant to be reopened, no matter how softly the knocking comes. If there is one thing 14 months taught me, it is this: blood will tell you who someone is related to, but only loyalty will tell you who someone actually is, and the two are never, ever guaranteed to be the same person. So let me ask you honestly, before you go, if the people closest to you spent months quietly building a case to erase you from your own life, would you have the patience to sit still, smile, and build your case in silence the way I did, or would the truth have come out of you the very first day? Tell me in the comments. And if this story meant something to you tonight, do me one favor before you go, like this video, subscribe for the next one, and I'll see you there.